The year is 1854. Britain is mobilizing for war in Crimea. Ships loading supplies, troops assembling, artillery being transported. A massive military operation against Russia, and here's what nobody tells you. The British government couldn't afford it. The treasury was stretched. Tax revenues were insufficient. The budget had no room for a major continental war. By every traditional measure, Britain should have stood down, should have negotiated, should have avoided conflict. But the war happened anyway, because someone else was willing to pay for it. Not the government, not the British people. Private banks. Specifically, the House of Rothschild. They stepped in with something revolutionary. War bonds on an unprecedented scale. Welcome to ConflictCapital, where we follow the money behind every war. The Crimean War wasn't won on the battlefield. It was financed into existence. This was the moment when private banking fundamentally changed how wars work. Before Crimea, governments fought wars they could afford. After Crimea, governments fight wars banks will fund. The shift is subtle, but catastrophic. When governments control war financing, they face fiscal limits. Run out of money, the war ends. Simple, brutal, but clear. When banks control war financing, those limits disappear. Governments can borrow to continue fighting. And here's the trap. Once you've borrowed massive sums for war, stopping means defaulting, means financial ruin, means admitting the money was wasted. So wars continue, not because they're winnable, not because they're popular, because stopping costs more than continuing. The debt creates lock-in. Financial commitment becomes military commitment. The Crimean War established this pattern. £76 million, 33 million added directly to national debt. Money borrowed from private financiers who profited regardless of outcome. And the war itself, a disaster, mismanaged, unpopular, deadly. 25,000 British casualties, mostly from disease. Strategic objectives unclear. Military leadership incompetent, but it didn't stop, couldn't stop. The money had been borrowed, the bonds had been issued. Investors expected returns. Stopping meant financial catastrophe, so it continued. Through brutal winters, through cholera outbreaks, through public outcry, the government fell. And banks don't accept military failure as grounds for default. This is the banking coup, not a violent overthrow, a structural one. The moment when financial markets seized control over when wars start and when they end. Let's understand what made this possible. Why governments needed banks in the first place. Why traditional war financing collapsed. 1853, Britain hasn't fought a major European war in 40 years. Since Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815, peace, relative peace, small colonial conflicts, manageable expenses, but nothing like the continental wars of the previous century. This peace dividend matters. Government budgets adjusted, military spending fell, infrastructure improved, the economy grew. Britain became the workshop of the world. But this created a hidden vulnerability. Military capacity atrophied, not the troops themselves, the financial mechanisms, the systems for rapidly mobilizing resources for war. Previous wars were financed through established patterns. During the Napoleonic Wars, government raised money through three sources: heavy taxation, short-term treasury bills, and long-term bonds called consols. Taxes during Napoleon's time were crushing. Income tax introduced at 2 shillings in the pound, duties on everything. The public paid directly for war costs, immediately, painfully. This created fiscal discipline. High taxes caused domestic unrest. Governments facing tax rebellions think twice before continuing unprofitable wars. The pain is distributed, the population feels it, democratic pressure builds. But by 1853, this system was gone. Income tax had been abolished after Waterloo, reintroduced reluctantly in 1842 as a temporary measure. The British public hated it, considered it wartime emergency taxation only. So when war with Russia loomed, the government faced a problem. They couldn't simply raise taxes to wartime levels anymore. The political cost was too high. The public wouldn't tolerate it for what seemed like a distant conflict over obscure religious disputes in Palestine. And there was a bigger issue. Industrial warfare costs more, much more. Railways for troop transport, telegraph lines for communication, steamships instead of sailing vessels, modern rifles, explosive shells, all expensive. Crimea would be the first industrial war. And industrial wars require industrial-scale financing. The old methods, the tax and borrow gradually approach, couldn't mobilize resources fast enough. The government needed large sums immediately, couldn't wait for tax collection cycles, couldn't impose wartime taxation without massive political backlash. The fiscal machinery of previous wars no longer functioned. This is the crisis. Modern war requiring unprecedented resources. Traditional financing inadequate. Government caught between military necessity and fiscal impossibility. Enter the banks. Lionel de Rothschild, head of the British branch of the Rothschild banking empire, a man who'd financed governments across Europe, who'd arranged loans for Prussia, Austria, France, who had networks in every major capital, and who saw an opportunity. The British government needed money, lots of money, fast. Rothschild could provide it, not through traditional government treasury operations, through private bond issuance on a scale never attempted before. Here's how it worked. The government would issue bonds, long-term debt obligations promising to pay bondholders with interest. Rothschild would underwrite these bonds, guarantee their sale, use his banking network to distribute them across Europe. Investors would buy bonds, wealthy individuals, other banks, European nobility, anyone with capital seeking stable returns. They'd pay the Rothschild bank. The bank would forward money to the British government minus fees. The genius, this bypassed normal fiscal constraints. The government didn't need to raise taxes immediately, didn't need parliamentary approval for each expenditure, just sell more bonds. The money appeared when needed. Rothschild arranged the first loan in 1854. £3.3 million, favorable terms given British and French support for the Ottoman Empire against Russia. Second loan in 1855, larger, more expensive. As war dragged on, borrowing costs increased. But critically, Rothschild profited either way. Win or lose, bonds paid interest. Government default was unthinkable. Britain's credit, built over centuries, guaranteed repayment. The bank took fees up front, earned interest over time, bore minimal risk. This created a revolutionary dynamic. Banks wanted wars funded, not necessarily won. Victory was irrelevant to profitability. The longer wars lasted, the more borrowing required, the more fees collected. Compare this to government financing. When government pays directly, every expenditure hurts. Tax revenue diverted from productive uses, public anger growing, pressure to end conflict quickly. But when banks provide funding, government faces different pressures. Debt service costs seem manageable initially, just interest payments, principal repayment decades away. The pain is deferred, and banks actively encourage continued borrowing. Rothschild reassured government that resources were available, that more loans could be arranged, that military operations needn't be constrained by immediate fiscal reality. This is the banking intervention, not just providing money, restructuring the entire relationship between finance and warfare, making long-term debt the primary war funding mechanism. It worked brilliantly for the banks. The Crimean War generated enormous profits for the Rothschild network. Interest payments on £76 million in total war costs would flow for decades. Fees on bond issuance provided immediate returns for the British government. The arrangement seemed acceptable initially. Money available when needed. Military operations unconstrained. Public taxation limited. Political backlash minimized. But there was a hidden cost, a trap built into the structure itself. 1854. War begins. Public enthusiasm high. Press coverage supportive. Britain defending civilization against Russian aggression. Easy to sell politically, but by winter 1854, reality hits. British Army at Sevastopol, freezing. Supplies inadequate. Medical care non-existent. Disease rampant. Soldiers dying not from battle but from cholera, typhoid, exposure. William Howard Russell, war correspondent for the Times, sends reports back. Shocking accounts. The Army's supply department completely unprepared. Wounded men lying in filth. No bandages, no medicine, hospitals overwhelmed. Public opinion shifts. This isn't glorious. This is catastrophic. The military leadership is incompetent. Lord Raglan, the British commander, purchased his commission through wealth and connections, not ability. Decisions are disastrous. The charge of the Light Brigade, October 1854, British cavalry ordered to attack Russian artillery positions. A miscommunicated order. 670 cavalrymen charged directly into cannon fire. 110 killed, 160 wounded, a massacre. The public is horrified. Parliament is angry. In January 1855, Prime Minister Lord Aberdeen faces a no-confidence vote, loses, forced to resign. The war is deeply unpopular. Here's where the financial trap springs shut. New Prime Minister Lord Palmerston wants to end the war. The strategic objectives are unclear. The costs are mounting. The casualties are unconscionable. Every rational calculation says, negotiate peace, withdraw, cut losses. But the money, £33 million already borrowed. Bonds issued across Europe. Interest payments beginning. Investors expecting returns. Stopping the war means admitting it was a mistake. Means explaining to taxpayers that borrowed millions produced nothing. Means decades of debt service for a failed venture. And banks won't write off the debt. War failure isn't grounds for loan forgiveness. The bonds were sold as government obligations. Britain's credit depends on honoring them, so the math becomes perverse. Continuing the war, despite its unpopularity, despite its failure, despite its cost, becomes fiscally preferable to stopping. Because stopping means pure loss. No possible justification for the debt. No victory to claim, just waste. Continuing offers hope. Maybe Sevastopol falls. Maybe Russia sues for peace. Maybe something happens that lets government claim victory, justify the spending, sell the debt as worthwhile investment. This is lock-in. The structure of debt financing creates incentives to continue failed wars, not because military logic demands it, because financial logic does. The war drags through 1855. More borrowing, more casualties, more public anger. But the government can't stop. The fiscal commitment has created military commitment. Finally, September 1855, Sevastopol falls, not through British success, but French assault. The Malakoff Redoubt captured. Russians abandon the city. Even then, the war doesn't immediately end. The Allies spend another winter in Crimea. Finally, March 1856 Treaty of Paris, Russia accepts defeat. Look at what was accomplished. Russia surrenders southern Bessarabia, Black Sea demilitarized, Ottoman Empire preserved, limited strategic gains. Nothing that justified £76 million. Nothing that justified 25,000 British deaths, but the debt remained £33 million added to national debt. Bonds issued at various interest rates, some as high as 3%. Interest payments required annually. For decades, the British government would spend more on Crimean war debt service over the next 40 years than on the war itself. Money flowing to bondholders year after year for a war universally recognized as mismanaged and unnecessary. This is the true cost of debt-financed war, not just the initial borrowing, the decades of servicing, the opportunity cost, the productive investments not made because resources go to past military failures, and the precedent, the demonstration that wars can be fought beyond fiscal means, that governments aren't constrained by immediate budgets, that banks will provide funding, creating obligations that outlast the conflicts themselves. Fast forward 2001, the United States faces a new kind of war. Terrorism, asymmetric conflict. No clear battlefield, no defined enemy nation. Afghanistan first, then Iraq. Operations in Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia. The global war on terror. Expansive, expensive, open-ended. And here's the critical detail. Entirely financed through debt. Not taxation, not war bonds sold to citizens, not fiscal sacrifice by the general population. Borrowed money from domestic investors, from foreign governments, from bond markets. The numbers, $5 to $8 trillion, depending what you include. Direct military operations, State Department spending, veterans health care, homeland security expansion, interest on borrowed funds, but focus on the mechanism, the financing structure. Because it's the Crimean model, scaled up, perfected, made permanent. During World War II, the U.S. government raised taxes dramatically. Top marginal rate reached 94%. War bonds sold to ordinary citizens. Everyone contributed, everyone sacrificed. The fiscal burden was distributed. Korean War, same pattern. Truman temporarily raised top tax rate to 92%. The public paid for the war through taxation. Immediately, directly. Vietnam War, taxes increased. Top rate pushed to 77%. Even then, insufficient. Government still borrowed. But there was at least an attempt to pay through taxation. 2001 changes everything. President Bush launches Afghanistan War. Then, Iraq War. Does he raise taxes? No, he cuts them. Massively. The Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2001 reduces rates across the board. The Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2003 cuts capital gains and dividend taxes, tax cuts totaling $1.7 trillion over 10 years. While fighting wars estimated to cost $5 to $8 trillion, the math is insane. How is this possible? Debt. Pure debt financing. The government borrows to fund military operations, borrows to cover tax cuts. Federal debt rises from $3.5 trillion in 2001 to $20 trillion by 2020. And who lends? Bond markets, domestic investors buying treasury securities. Foreign governments, especially China and Japan, purchasing U.S. debt. Banks underwriting bond issuance. The mechanism is identical to Crimean War financing. Governments bypass immediate fiscal constraints through borrowing. Banks profit from fees and interest. The debt creates lock-in that makes stopping wars financially painful. Look at Iraq. March 2003. Invasion begins. Initial estimates: $80 billion total cost. Quick operation. Establish democracy. Withdraw. Vice President Cheney predicts American forces will be greeted as liberators. Reality: complete disaster. No weapons of mass destruction found. No stable democracy established. Sectarian violence explodes. Occupation costs skyrocket. By 2006, clear the war is failing. Public opinion turns. Democrats win congressional elections, partly on anti-war sentiment. Calls to withdraw grow. Does the U.S. withdraw? No. Surge strategy deployed. More troops, more spending. The war continues through 2011. Total cost $1.9 trillion, including long-term obligations. Why? Same lock-in mechanism as Crimea. Money borrowed, bonds issued. Debt service beginning. Stopping means admitting the initial trillion-plus was wasted. Continuing offers hope of salvaging something, of claiming mission accomplished, of justifying the debt. Afghanistan worse. War begins October 2001. Initial operation succeeds. Taliban defeated. Mission accomplished, declared. But troops remain. Mission expands. Nation building begins. Costs accumulate. Years pass. A decade, then another. 20 years. Public support collapses. Everyone knows the war is unwinnable. Every assessment says the Afghan government will fall once American forces leave. Every calculation says continued occupation achieves nothing. But the money? Over $2 trillion spent. Borrowed, added to national debt. With interest, the cost reaches $8 trillion by mid-century. That's just interest, not principal, not the actual war costs. Interest alone. Stopping means admitting it was all waste. 20 years, $2 trillion. Nothing accomplished. Taliban returns to power regardless, so the war continues. Through Obama administration, through Trump, finally, Biden withdraws in 2021. Taliban retakes Afghanistan in weeks, proving what everyone knew. The entire two-decade occupation achieved nothing permanent. Total cost of post-9/11 wars. Direct spending plus interest, $6.5 trillion in interest alone by 2050. For wars that failed to achieve stated objectives. Iraq, not a stable democracy. Afghanistan, under Taliban control. Terrorism spread, not eliminated, but the debt remains, will remain for decades. Americans born in 2003 will pay interest on Iraq war debt into their 60s. The fiscal burden transferred to future generations who had no say in the wars, who received no benefit, who simply serviced debt for past military failures. This is the Crimean pattern fully realized. Wars financed through debt, continuing despite failure because debt creates lock-in. Costs deferred, burdens transferred, banks profit, taxpayers pay for generations, and the mechanism is identical. Private bond markets replacing democratic fiscal constraint. Government spending unconstrained by immediate budgets. Lock-in created by debt obligations that outlast the wars themselves. So what did we learn from Crimea? What pattern was established? What precedent set? The Crimean War proved that wars don't need to be affordable, don't need public support, don't need clear objectives or competent execution. They just need banks willing to lend. Before Crimea, fiscal reality constrained military ambition. Governments fought wars they could pay for. When money ran out, Wars ended. Simple, brutal, but democratic. The people controlled through taxation. After Crimea, this constraint disappeared. Banks provide capital, debt replaces taxes. Wars continue beyond fiscal means, beyond public support, beyond strategic sense. The lock-in effect is structural. Once massive debt is incurred for war, stopping becomes more expensive than continuing. Not militarily, financially, because stopping means admitting the borrowed money was wasted. Continuing offers hope of justification. Britain borrowed £33 million for Crimea, paid interest for 40 years, more than the war cost, for a war everyone recognized as unnecessary and mismanaged. The United States borrowed trillions for Iraq and Afghanistan, will pay interest for 50 years, $6.5 trillion in interest alone, for wars that failed completely, that everyone acknowledges accomplished nothing. The mechanism is the same. The scale is larger. The pattern is established. And here's the terrifying part. It's getting worse, because debt is cheaper than ever. Interest rates at historic lows through the 2010s, borrowing costs minimal. Government can fight wars, cut taxes simultaneously, and face no immediate fiscal pressure. The 2020s might change this. Interest rates rising, debt service costs climbing. In fiscal year 2024, United States spent $880 billion on debt interest, more than defense spending, equal to Medicare. 13% of the entire federal budget. This is the bill coming due. Not for current programs, for past wars. For borrowed money spent decades ago, still being serviced, still consuming resources, and the lock-in continues. Because defaulting on government debt is unthinkable, destroys credit, crashes economy, makes future borrowing impossible. So the pattern repeats. New conflicts emerge: Ukraine, Taiwan tensions, Middle East instability. Each potential war, each requiring financing, each creating new debt, new lock-in, new multi-decade servicing costs. The banking coup that funded the Crimean War wasn't a conspiracy, wasn't a secret plot. It was a structural evolution. Banks stepping in where governments couldn't, providing capital markets where fiscal constraints failed. But the consequence, war is no longer controlled by democratic fiscal constraint, no longer limited by what populations will pay, limited only by what bond markets will lend. And bond markets will lend as long as government credit remains solid, as long as repayment is guaranteed, regardless of whether wars are just, whether they're winnable, whether they serve any purpose beyond enriching bondholders. The Crimean War cost £76 million. Interest payments cost more. Iraq and Afghanistan cost $5 to $8 trillion. Interest payments will cost more. The ratio is consistent. The pattern endures. Once banks fund war, the exit disappears. Not immediately, not visibly, but structurally, because debt creates obligations that transcend military logic, that outlasts public support, that bind future generations to past mistakes. The British, in 1856, knew the Crimean War was disaster, ended it anyway, but paid for it for 40 years. Americans in 2021 knew Afghanistan was failure, ended it anyway, will pay for it for 50 years. This is the true cost, not the bombs dropped, not the lives lost. The decades of servicing debt for wars that shouldn't have been fought, that accomplished nothing, that everyone recognizes as failures, but were fought anyway. Because banks would lend and governments would borrow, and fiscal constraint disappeared. That's the banking coup. That's the mechanism established at Crimea and perfected in Iraq. That's the world we live in now. Wars financed into existence, continued through failure, serviced for generations, while banks collect interest and taxpayers pay, and the pattern repeats. When war pays for itself through debt, it doesn't stop. It just gets refinanced, again and again and again. That's the lesson of the Crimean War. That's the trap of debt-financed conflict. That's the world the Rothschilds helped create, and we're still living in it, still paying for it, still trapped by it. The Crimean War proved that modern conflict no longer depended on national treasuries. Once banks learned how to finance war, capital began flowing beyond borders, laws, and public oversight. But bonds were only the beginning. The next phase of war finance moved into trade, addiction, and illicit markets, starting with the opium trade. Check out the next video where we examine how the opium trade built the first global black market. If you appreciate analysis that exposes the hidden mechanisms of power and finance, consider subscribing to the channel, like the video, and share. Understanding how we got here might be the only way to change where we're going. Thanks for watching.